Evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming down tonight. Brave book lovers, braving the elements, coming down to Books and Books tonight. We are live, so for our internet audience watching at home, if at any time during the presentation you'd like to purchase a copy of tonight's book, please call the number on your screen. We'll take care of that for you. We'll have the author sign it for you, and we'll get it shipped to wherever you are in the United States free of charge. For those of you watching overseas, the shipping charge might be just a little bit more. Well, this evening, Books and Books is very happy to welcome back Ms. Joanna Rakoff, presenting her new book, My Salinger Year. Ms. Rakoff has written for the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Vogue, and many other publications. Her first book, the novel A Fortunate Age, won the Goldberg Prize for Jewish Fiction by Emerging Writers and the Elle Readers Prize, and was a New York Times Editor's Choice and a San Francisco Chronicle bestseller. My Salinger Year is a memoir, and this is the type of story that book lovers are going to love. In it, Joanna tells the story of how, at the age of 23, she moved to New York City and took a job as assistant to J.D. Salinger's agent. She is tasked with answering Salinger's fan mail. But as she reads these letters from Salinger's fans from around the world, she finds herself unable to type out the agency's form response, and instead she abandons the template and begins writing back, which is amazing, right? This book is getting great reviews. I have a quote here from the author Maggie Shipstead. She says, "Here is the story of a reader becoming a writer, of a young woman deciding who she will be, of the power of books. Here is a memoir that manages to be dreamlike but sharp, poignant but unsentimental. Here is a book I'm going to have to insist you read immediately." Here to tell us more about it, please give a very warm welcome to Ms. Joanna Rakoff.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be back here. This is one of my favorite bookstores. Thank you guys so much for coming out in the rain. I was getting dressed in my hotel room a couple blocks away, frazzled from flying here and racing around doing interviews and whatever, and I was like, I'm getting dressed and there's a hurricane going on. I'm probably doing this, not going to get there, and no one will be there. And so it's thrilling that you're here. Okay, so as Victor explained, My Salinger Year is indeed a chronicle of 1 year, 1 calendar year, just by chance. I began working at this literary agency, which in the book is just called The Agency, just to make it seem more ominous and scary, though it kind of was a little bit CIA-like in its secrecy and its kind of coded ways of doing things, and its feeling of its own importance. I started working there in January of 1996, and I stayed on for exactly 1 calendar year. The novel, oh my God, I've been traveling too much. It's not a novel, it's all real. It actually is all real, that's the sad part. The book picks up with me having just moved back to the States from London, where I was in grad school, and I was this kind of earnest doctoral student in English literature. I was 23. I had been living in London with my college boyfriend. We went to Oberlin, if that means anything to anyone, and we were these like incredibly Oberlin sorts of idealistic young people who were both sort of very focused on sort of making academic, liberal lives for ourselves. So my boyfriend, my college boyfriend, went to Berkeley to start his own doctorate in composition. He's a composer. And I was supposed to join him there. And I instead just kind of went off the rails. I just didn't go. I went out, and then I basically said, I'm going to go home and deal with some things and get my stuff. I'm going to go back. I'm from New York. I'm going to go back to New York and deal with some things. And then I just never went back. I got a job working as I know that sounds deranged, and it was. I got a job working as a Barbra Streisand. I know you're thinking, like, please, my daughter, don't do that. I got a job working as a PA on a Barbra Streisand film, and which sounds glamorous and maybe and exciting, but it was horrible and grueling, and it made me never want to watch a film ever again, though I turned my back on that, obviously. And then kind of fell into this job at the agency, having no idea what a literary agency was. I had never dreamed of working in publishing. I thought I was going to be an academic and or a writer in some way. I didn't know what way. But I truly did not know what an agency was. And so I'm just trying to think if there's anything else that you need to know when I'm going to read two bits that are sort of about the Salinger part of the story. The other part of the story just has to do with me living in Brooklyn, in Williamsburg, before there was anything in Williamsburg, when it was just kind of empty streets and ramshackle working class, vinyl tiled buildings, and living with this horrible pseudo-socialist boyfriend who was endlessly working on a novel that was like a parable about the class structure in the United States, and stuff like my friends deciding that they were going to get married at age 23 and have like $1 million weddings at the Central Park Boathouse, and then being angry that their moms didn't want to pay for it, and my friends sort of moving in all these directions, and my thinking, who are they? But I'm going to read from the parts about Salinger. So, let me...
How old was he at the time?
How old was Salinger? He was, in 1996, I believe he was 73. Okay. Wait, I've left out the most important thing, which is that this agency looked kind of like Books and Books. So it really did kind of look like this, except if you can imagine this room times 4, but with, in quotes, oriental carpets spread all over the floors, piled all over the floors like a kind of Upper East Side rich person's living room, only missing the kind of like, antelope heads on the walls or whatever, and it had dark wood furniture. But all of this is important. The setting is important because it wasn't like this, but with the accoutrements of a modern office. So the agency was kind of trapped in its heyday. It had been founded in the 20s. It was the oldest literary agency in New York, and they represented writers. They kind of invented literary agenting, and they represented writers like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Agatha Christie and Dylan Thomas, and of course J.D. Salinger came later, and he was attracted to them because they represented Fitzgerald. However, they were like the land frozen in time, or whatever the actual phrase is there, the land that time forgot. There were no computers. This is 1996, no computers. They had just recently acquired a fax machine, and they thought it was like this crazy newfangled thing. And there were these kind of like rituals surrounding how you use the fax machine, and if you veered from them, my boss, who was the president of the company, would just go crazy and be like, you didn't write the number on the back of the cover sheet and the front, and that kind of thing. They had also only recently acquired a Xerox machine, until a few years before assistants like myself had to type I typed on a typewriter, typed on our typewriters using carbon paper. So yes, so I mean in most offices, so to give you a sense of how just crazy this was, I mean you probably already know, but my closest friend from high school, she of the Central Park Boathouse wedding, worked a few blocks away at McGraw-Hill, the textbook publisher, and her office was paperless. They weren't supposed to print anything out. They communicated via, I'm trying to remember what it was called. It was an early chat thing. It was called like Mulberry or something. And so her cubicle mate, who was right there, would be like, "What are you having for lunch?" And she would type back, "Soup from the soup man," and so nobody even spoke to each other, and it was driving her insane. Meanwhile, I was in this office where, and this is where we get to, on my first day, my boss, who was smoking, like everyone in the office smoked and drank at their desks like as if it were Mad Men. But this was in 1996. And I was like, is smoking really legal in office buildings? But of course I didn't say anything to anyone. So on my first day, she said, so do you know how to use a dictaphone? And though she didn't say it like that, she sort of said, I'm assuming you know how to use a dictaphone, and then kind of just dropped the question. I was like, oh, of course. And I had no idea what a dictaphone was. I mean, do any of you know what a dictaphone is? Yeah, you do? Oh my God, you're so young. That's okay. So I had no idea. I thought it was like something out of Dr. Seuss, a dictaphone. And it turns out, you can probably figure out what it is. It's a dictation device. And I couldn't even, so I barely knew how to type. I had lied in the interview and said I could type. I was like, yes, I can type 65 words a minute. And I could not. And I couldn't even figure out how to turn on the typewriter. Someone had to come help me. And so this is where we pick up, is that afternoon. Someone has come to show me how to use the dictaphone. And you use it with foot pedals, by the way. Okay. I spent the morning listening to my boss's low, patrician voice murmuring to me through the dictaphone's ancient headgear, a peculiarly intimate experience. Letters. I was typing letters on the agency's letterhead, yellowish, undersized, 30-pound stock. Some several pages, some as brief as a line or two. As discussed, attached are 2 copies of your contract with St. Martin's Press for 2 if by blood. Please sign both copies and return them to me at your earliest convenience. The longest ones were addressed to publishers requesting intricate and often inexplicable changes to contracts, the striking of words and clauses, particularly those having to do with electronic rights, a term that meant nothing to me. Later on in the book, my boss screams, I don't know what an electronic book is, but I'm not giving away the rights to it. And it's funny because she didn't know, which was like we all thought she was being totally crazy, but she was right. So anyway, okay. These letters proved both unbearably tedious, requiring gymnastic feats of formatting and spacing, and oddly soothing, for I understood so little of their content that the typing itself, my fingers on the keyboard, the sound of the keys striking the paper, hypnotized me. Typing was, as the placement agency lady had assured me, like riding a bike. My fingers remembered their places on the keyboard and flew across it as if by their own will. By noon, I had a neat stack of letters, the product of 1 dictation tape, addressed envelopes neatly clipped to them, as Hugh had instructed. Hugh was the office manager who was one of those people who looked as if he lived in the office, like he'd never seen the light of day. And his job was really, I couldn't figure out his job for so long, and then I realized that his job was basically, he was the curator of the agency. So you could say to him, F. Scott Fitzgerald published this story in 1934, and he'd say, was it this, this, or this? Like he just knew everything, and you would say, so there was a contract, and he would just finish your sentence. He would be like, for Margaret Sherman's blah, 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 and he would just pull it out of nowhere. He was amazing. Okay, as I popped out the first tape and put in the second, my phone rang, and I froze. I still wasn't sure of the appropriate greeting. Hello, I said with false confidence, tucking the phone behind my ear. This was my first real phone call. Joanna, a mirthful voice cried. Dad? I asked. It is I, affirmed my father in his Boris Karloff voice. My father, in his youth, had been an actor. His comedy group performed in the Catskills, at bungalow colonies, and the occasional resort. The other members became famous. Tony Curtis, Jerry Stiller. My father became a dentist who told jokes. Dear old Dad, it is I. How's your first day at work? Okay. My parents had asked for my work number minutes after I told them I had a job. I hadn't thought they'd call my first day. I've just been typing letters. Well, you're a secretary now, said my dad, laughing. I came from a family of scientists, and my every move seemed to provide them with amusement. Oh, sorry, he said. An assistant. I think it's slightly different from being a secretary, I said, hating the solemn tone of my voice. This was another constant refrain in my family. Joanna takes everything too seriously. Joanna can't take a joke. Joanna has no sense of humor. We're just teasing, Joanna. You don't need to get upset. And yet I always did. I'm going to be reading manuscripts, I told him. This was the only non-secretarial task that came to mind. My boss, as it happened, hadn't mentioned it, but everyone I'd spoken to in the week since accepting the job had emphasized that assisting an agent primarily involved reading manuscripts. No one I'd spoken to had mentioned typing or a dictaphone. Stuff like that, manuscripts. They were looking for someone with a background like mine in English. Yes, yes, cooed my dad. Of course. Listen, I've been thinking, how much are they paying you again? I looked around to make sure I was alone. $18,500. $18,000? My father cried. I thought it was more. He made a guttural noise of disgust, the last remaining evidence that he'd been raised in a Yiddish-speaking household. $18,000 a year? $18,500, I told him. This sum struck me as huge. In college, I'd earned $1,500 per semester as a writing tutor, and in grad school, I'd scraped by on minimum wage, serving beer at a pub and fitting hiking boots at a camping store off Oxford Street. $18,500 was a vast and unimaginable amount of money to me, perhaps because I imagined it as a lump sum, handed over in stacks of crisp bills. You know, Joe, I don't think you can live on that. Do you think you could ask them for more? Dad, I said, I've already started the job. I know, but maybe you could tell them you've looked at your expenses and you just can't live on that little money. Let's see. My father could do complex calculations in his head. $1,500 a month after taxes, maybe $800, $900 a month. Are they paying for your health insurance? I don't know. I'd been told the agency provided insurance, which would kick in 3 months after I started, or maybe 6 months, and which I assumed they covered, but I'd honestly not paid very much attention to the financial details. The fact that I had an actual job seemed to supersede any other concerns. This was 1996. The country was in the grips of a recession. Almost no one I knew was gainfully employed. My friends were in grad school, getting MFAs in fiction or PhDs in film theory, or working at coffee shops in Portland, or selling T-shirts in San Francisco, or living with their parents on the Upper West Side. A job, an actual 9-to-5 job, was an almost alien concept at this moment, an abstraction. Okay. So now I'm going to actually read to you about Salinger. Okay, so an hour or two has passed. The book does not move in real time. It does actually go through a year, but just for the purposes of tonight, an hour or two has passed. So I've been typing and typing and typing, and finally the Hugh person who has never seen the light of day comes over and says, did anyone tell you you can go get lunch? It's like 2:30 or 3 in the afternoon. I was starving and also lightheaded because my boss chain smoked, and so this stream of smoke was coming through from, I worked in this kind of antechamber outside her office and thought I was kind of going to, I didn't smoke, and I felt like I was going to die. So he sort of sends me out and into the world, and here's what happens. Out on Madison, I found myself gazing through the windows of a chain sandwich shop. Its wares too much for me because everything was too much for me. I had nothing. A few dollars my dad had slipped me meant to last until my first paycheck, which I presumed would come at the end of the week. I didn't even have a bank account in New York. I had so little money, there seemed no point. My account in London was still open, and there was some cash in it, but I wasn't sure how much or how to access it in this pre-electronic era. My wallet held 2 credit cards, but these I reserved for emergencies, and it didn't occur to me that I might use them for anything but, that I might use them for something as unnecessary as lunch, no matter how hungry I was. I decided, simply buy a cup of coffee and an apple, a couple of dollars at most. On the west side of Madison, I turned into a deli and inspected a vast pile of overripe bananas. What you like? Called the white-clad man behind the sandwich counter, smiling. Turkey on a hard roll, I said, without really intending to, my heart beating with the recklessness of this gesture. Provolone lettuce mayo, just a little, and mustard. At the register, I handed over a 10 and was given $2 and 2 quarters back, several dollars more than I'd expected to spend on so humble a sandwich. My pulse quickened with regret. $5 was lunch. $7.50 was dinner. Back at my desk, I set down my sandwich and slipped off my coat. As I pulled out my chair to sit down, my boss appeared in the doorway to her office. Oh, good, you're back, she said. Come in and have a seat. We have some things to talk about. Glancing sadly at my sandwich, wrapped tightly in white butcher paper, I walked into her office and sat down in one of the straight-back chairs that faced her desk. So, she said, settling in her own chair, behind that vast expanse of desk, we need to talk about Jerry. I nodded, though I had no idea who Jerry was. People are going to call and ask for his address. his phone number. They're going to ask you to put them in touch with him. Or me. She laughed at the ridiculousness of this. Reporters will call, students, graduate students. She rolled her eyes. They'll say they want to interview him or give him a prize or an honorary degree or who knows what. Producers will call about the film rights. They'll try to get around you. They may be very persuasive, very manipulative, but you must never, behind those huge, heavy glasses, her eyes narrowed and she leaned across the desk like a caricature of a gangster, her voice taking on a frightening edge. Never, never, never give out his address or phone number. Don't tell them anything. Don't answer their questions. Just get off the phone as quickly as possible. Do you understand? I nodded. Never, ever, ever are you to give out his address or phone number. I understand, I told her, though I wasn't sure I did, as I didn't know who Jerry was. This was 1996, and the first Jerry that came to mind was Seinfeld, who presumably wasn't a client of the agency, though one never knew, I supposed. Okay, she said, sitting back in her chair. You understand. Now go. I'm going to take a look at your correspondence. She gestured to the pile of papers I'd typed, neatly stacked on her desk. Seeing them, oddly, gave me a little rush of pride. They were so beautiful, that heavy yellow bond crowded with letters in inky black. As I left her office, smoothing my skirt, I happened to glance at the bookcases directly to the right of her doorway, on the wall opposite the side of my desk that held the typewriter. I'd been staring at that bookcase all day, staring at it without seeing it, so focused was I on my typing. The case held books in corresponding hues: mustard, maroon, turquoise, imprinted with bold black type. I'd seen these books countless times, in my parents' bookcase and the English department closet at my high school, at every bookstore and library I'd ever visited, and of course in the hands of friends. I'd never read them myself, due at first purely to happenstance, then to conscious choice. Books so ubiquitous on the contemporary bookshelf, I barely noticed them. The Catcher in the Rye, Franny and Zoe, 9 stories. Salinger. The agency represented J.D. Salinger. I'd reached my desk before it hit me. Oh, I thought, that Jerry. Okay. Thank you, guys. Should I?
Sure, questions, please.
Yes.
Had you read Catcher in the Rye and liked it or been attracted to it?
No, so I've never read any Salinger. Everyone in my family was a huge Salinger fan. We had, I think, all of his books, even Raise High the Roof Beam Carpenters and Seymour an Introduction, the least popular one, on the bookshelf of the house I grew up in. That we had a sort of early edition of Franny and Zoe that was inscribed to my mom from my brother and sisters. Everyone in my family loved Salinger, and I had been resistant to Salinger. I thought of myself as a very serious reader and writer who was only interested in gritty fictions, and I also was very interested in contemporary fiction. That was, as a doctoral student, that was what I was writing about, and so I thought that I was interested in, and I say I thought I was interested in because I wasn't actually interested in. I just tried to convince myself that I was, in writers like Martin Amis, and sort of minimalists like Raymond Carver and that kind of thing. And it turns out that I'm not really interested in those writers. I mean, I am, but my tendency is more toward maximalism. I love more sort of Victorian writers, which I think of Salinger as sort of being more in that lineage. Yes.
Without giving away too much, can you share with us a little bit about what caused you to move away from the template and start responding?
Yes. Okay, I'm just going to confess something here. So I accidentally read the wrong passage. I was going to... I had been planning on reading the little passage I just read to you, and then the passage that explains why I began responding to people. I had been considering reading the thing about my dad because I'm in Florida, which is sort of a place of my dad. So that it would have all been answered. But basically, the letters were, I was going to say they weren't normal fan letters, but I don't know what a normal fan letter is. Like, I'm assuming that there's a kind of typical letter that someone would write to, like, a 12-year-old would write to, like, Taylor Swift or something, I don't know, or Justin Bieber, that would be like, I love you, you know, like, you're so hot, or what, I don't know what. But
Joanna, I don't know, maybe folks would like to hear that other passage if you don't mind doing a second passage.
If you want me to, I can. Okay.
Plenty of time.
Okay. I never want to be one of the, have you guys ever been to readings where people are like, and now I will read another segment of my epic tone poem about the death of my cat. Have you ever been to those? Because I've been to those readings. And I've also been on panels where there are 5 people and there's the one person you're supposed to read for 5 minutes and there's the person who reads for half an hour and they're like, and there's another chapter about my gerbil eating its babies, and you're like, no. So anyway, I never want to be that person. So anyway, okay. Okay, so this is about the letter. So basically, I'll just explain. About a month into my time at the agency, this same person, Hugh, who is sort of a big figure in my life, this strange mole man, I mean that in like the best way possible, actually, dumped this pile of letters on my desk and said, oh, these are the Salinger letters. You need to answer them. And I said, what? And he said, they're letters from Salinger's fans. He doesn't want to see his fan letters. It's your job to answer them. And I said, oh, can I just say whatever I want? And he said, no, oh my God, are you completely out of your mind? And his face turned all red. And he said, there's a form letter. I'll find it for you. And he went to his desk, which was one of those desks that was covered with like a giant mountain of papers. But he was one of those people who could just go over to it and pluck the exact thing that he wanted off of it, and plucked this carbon of a letter from 1963 that said, you know, dear Miss So-and-so, thank you for your kind letter to J.D. Salinger. As you know, Mr. Salinger does not wish to see his fan mail, thus we cannot send on your letter to Mr. Salinger. You know, please do not ever write to us again or ever even think about Salinger as you go to sleep at night. You know, please start reading another writer. You know, maybe you would like Kurt Vonnegut. He's much friendlier and does not attract stalkers in the same way that Salinger does, so just go away. Maybe John Updike, someone might suit your fancy. So I was supposed to, so here again, no computers, hundreds of letters a week. I was supposed to just type this letter over and over and over again. So an hour or two later, he came back and he said, I forgot to tell you, you should actually read the letters. Don't just open them up and, you know, jot out the form letter. You need to read them because, I suspect you guys are probably guessing why, because crazy people are attracted to Salinger. As in, you know, Mark David Chapman crazy people who are, you know, somehow using The Catcher in the Rye as a justification for murdering people. And Salinger himself, part of the reason that he stopped wanting to see his fan letters, there were other reasons, but part of the reason he stopped wanting to see them was because he himself was receiving threats. Threats to him and also to his children, who were quite young at the time. So he just was freaked out, understandably. So they wanted me to read the letter. So I, of course, the minute I was left alone, like immediately ripped them all open and read them all instead of doing the incredibly boring things I was supposed to be doing, like looking over contracts or whatever. And the letters were, you know, completely fascinating, and they kind of fell into these categories. And this is the last thing I'll say, and then I'll read this. Basically, there were letters from veterans who were saying, you know, dear Mr. Salinger, I read your books when they came out and I love them, and now I'm retired. We're of the same generation. I fought in World War II just as you did. I saw horrible things just as you did. I'm rereading your books and they're the only works of fiction that truly capture my experiences during the war, even though they're not directly about the war. And some of them were just wonderful and so moving and so intelligent and lovely, not like those Justin Bieber letters that I am imagining in my head. And then there were letters that I thought of as tragic letters, which were letters from people who had undergone terrible experiences, you know, ovarian cancer, their children dying, horrible things of all stripes, who felt that Salinger had helped them through these kind of awful moments and this kind of loneliness and existential horror of going through these awful experiences. That was a really cumbersome sentence, forgive me. Anyway, and then there were teenagers who wrote in the voice of Holden Caulfield who were kind of like, "Dear Jerry, you old bastard, I'd get one hell of a kick out of it if you'd write back and tell me that I was a bastard. You know, everyone in my high school is a phony, and you're the only person that understands me," and that kind of thing. You know, "My friend Steve, he thinks he's cool, but he's really a crumb bun." And also teenage girls saying, "Holden, I love you," you know, that kind of thing. So then I get to this day in question, and here's what happens. The next morning, I turned to the letters straight away. There were the usual proclamations of love for Holden, the usual war stories, the usual stories of despair and redemption, the many, many letters from Denmark and the Netherlands and Japan. The Japanese loved Holden. I tapped out a few form responses and modified form responses. By this point, I tried to modify the letter just so it didn't sound like it was written in 1963, just because it seemed weird, because I signed my own name to it, and at 23, I thought that this mattered, that I couldn't sign my name to a letter that didn't sound like me. Now that sounds really dumb, but anyway. I filed away a few tragic letters for another day, then slit open an envelope addressed in bubbly, girlish script. The letter was almost a novella unto itself, this girl's story unfolding over 3 pages of wrinkly, pencil-smudged notebook paper. She was a freshman in high school, she explained, and she hated school, particularly English class, which she was failing. Her English teacher was maybe an all right person, but she didn't understand what it meant to be young, and she assigned the class these stupid books that had nothing to do with their lives. The only book the girl had liked over the course of the year was The Catcher in the Rye. As things stood, she was going to have to go to summer school or repeat freshman English, which would be so embarrassing. She wasn't sure if she could stand it, and her mother would kill her. The year was almost over, but she'd asked her teacher if she could do anything at all to bring her grade up, just enough so that she'd pass. "There is something you can do," the teacher told her. "Write a letter to J.D. Salinger and make it good enough that he'll write back. If he writes back, I'll give you an A." I thought, putting the letter down and staring for the millionth time at the wall of Salinger books. It was lunchtime, and I had a neat stack of letters ready to be mailed. I ran them through the postal meter. Again, very old-fashioned agency, postal meter. I ran them through the postal meter, threw on my coat, and slipped the girl's letter in my bag. Online to buy my salad. I ate the same thing for lunch every day, which was a Greek salad from Au Bon Pain that came with a tiny amount of feta cheese and 1 olive, because it was the only thing available that was less than $6 in this part of Madison, like sort of this advertising magazine area. Everything was really expensive. Online to buy my salad, I read it again. Despite various misspellings and sloppy penmanship, this girl wasn't a terrible writer. She conveyed her story vividly and honestly, with passion and detail. And then there was the pure audacity, the ballsiness, the brattiness of writing to J.D. Salinger and saying, "Please respond so I can get a free A." I kind of liked her. Salinger had been a terrible student himself. Perhaps he would like her too. Perhaps he would get a kick out of her letter. "I really need this A," I read, holding my plastic container of watery lettuce. "It will bring my entire GPA up to passing. My mother is mad at me all the time now. I know you understand." And yet, there was something that rankled me about this. What would Salinger say to her? I pondered this as I walked back to the office, across 49th Street and down Madison, the sun warming my bare arms. Salinger had failed out of schools himself. I knew this from the letters, many of which referred to incidents in Salinger's life. They could actually be informative, the letters. Holden, I knew, again from the letters, had also failed out of a few schools. Would either of them have attempted to maintain his place through this kind of trick? I hadn't read Catcher still, so I wasn't sure about Holden, but I knew that Salinger would not. He would have taken his failure as deserved. Back at my desk, I ate my olive, then turned toward the Selectric and banged out a response to the girl, suggesting that it was decidedly not in the spirit of Holden or Salinger to be worrying about grades or her mother's anger. If she wanted to be like Holden or Salinger, she should accept her failing grade, a grade she, by her own admission, deserved. Trying to trick herself into a grade she hadn't earned was a coward's way out, a phony's way out. If you desire an A, or at least a passing grade, there's only one way to earn it, I wrote. Can you believe I said this? You must study and do the work assigned to you. This might mean making up papers or tests. This might mean begging your teacher to give you another chance. This might mean apologizing or otherwise humbling yourself, but it is the only way. An A earned by trickery means absolutely nothing. As I signed the letter with my name, my heart raced happily. I had done the right thing. I was mastering the art of what would Salinger say, but I had also crossed a line, that barely visible scene between bemused interest or compassionate engagement or plain sympathy and utter over-involvement. Why could I not leave these letters alone, I asked myself as I walked to the mail meter. Why could I not just send on form letters to every single fan? The answer was plain. I loved them. They were exciting. When I read them, sitting at my desk alone on, say, a Friday morning when my boss was at home, I felt a strange charge, a mixture of anger and affection, disdain and empathy, admiration and disgust. These people were writing to me, or, well, no, to Salinger, care of me, about their marital frustrations, their dead children, their boredom and desperation. They wrote about their favorite songs and poems, about the trips they'd taken to the Grand Canyon and Hawaii, about their favorite dolls. They told me, or they told Salinger, things I knew for sure they'd never told anyone else. Could I, over and over, respond to them in the most formal, impersonal manner possible? Could I just abandon them? Could I let them think that no one cared, no one was listening? Okay, does that answer your question?
One real fast, did you ever decide to sign at J.D. Salinger? Did you ever go that far?
No, I didn't. The thing that's funny about my doing this is that I'm a very sort of obedient, rule-following person, and I did this in terror of being found. I'm also like a terrible liar, and I'm not a deceptive person, and I did this in terror of being found out. And so I would do these crazy things like, I was supposed to throw out the fan letters, but I also couldn't bear to throw them out. So I was afraid of getting in trouble for not throwing them out. So I would do these crazy things, like I kept a file folder filled with the letters in a secret compartment in my desk, and then I'd stay late at the office and stash them in my tote bag and bring them home. And because they were so wonderful that I just couldn't throw them away. And yeah.
You still have them?
I have one. I used to have a few, and they've disappeared, and I still have one left. So. Oh, what's your other question?
Why do you think that I guess I have some ideas about why the agency decided that they're going to be so prim and proper, they're not going to embrace technology, and they probably saw the writing on the wall. They probably don't exist anymore, I'm guessing.
They exist, but in very reduced form. When I worked there, they owned a full floor of a Madison Avenue office building, not a very fancy one, honestly, but still valuable real estate. And they've now sold off a big chunk of it. They're kind of in a little area. They were very luxurious offices, and now they're much, much, much smaller. They had done a lot of things to try to save the agency without embracing technology. And also, I should explain, they also were somewhat opposed to, and this is kind of arcane for people who aren't in the publishing or books world, or maybe not, I don't know. They hadn't embraced contemporary approaches to being an agency, as in, by this point, it was accepted that the way an agent would sell a book, like the way my agent sells my book, or any agent sells any book, is you have what's known as an auction, where you send out the manuscript to a bunch of editors and they bid on it. And my boss was from a much more kind of genteel, gentlemanly era. She actually wasn't necessarily, but she was not that old. She really wasn't at all. She sort of dressed as if she was much older than she actually was. but she sort of had these ideas that had been passed down to her from her predecessors, that it was gauche to talk about money, it was gauche to ask for more money. It was this just a really different mode of thinking about how a writer's life should work. It was almost as if, you know, all writers were, I mean, F. Scott Fitzgerald was always impoverished, and there are all these letters from him to the founder of the agency asking for money, but he was from a more kind of genteel background. So it was almost thinking that like all writers were from that kind of moneyed background and didn't necessarily need a big advance to live on, or I don't even know what, but it was just a different way. And so it was all of that. That was all of why they weren't doing so well. They'd tried to bring on younger agents who represented clients who were alive and writing rather than, you know, dead. And not producing that much, but those agents didn't necessarily last because it was very hard for them to work in an environment without, you know, voicemail or computers. So, anyway.
Did you get found out?
No, I didn't. A few years, maybe 6 or 7 years after I worked there, I wrote an essay about answering Salinger's fan mail, and I heard from the person who's known as Hugh in the book that my boss was tickled by it. So she really, a funny thing is that people recently, it's kind of died down, but there was this period when I was doing interviews, just this period a week or two ago, when people kept saying, your book reminds me of The Devil Wears Prada. And I thought, really? Because I actually thought of my boss, I liked my boss. You know, I didn't think of her as this kind of evil tormentor who was like, why are you wearing that ugly color? You know, she was, so, yes. Oh no, you're not asking me a question. I'm just confused. Yes.
I was going to ask the same question about whether you found out or not, but I don't suppose you ever spoke to Jerry on the phone.
I did. I spoke to him many, many, many times, and I met him as well. So a funny thing is that, or funny to me, I guess, we'll see if it's funny to you, is the day after that conversation in which my boss was like, you know, don't ever give out his address, you'll be fired if you do. And there'd apparently been an assistant who'd been fired for giving out his address, and Esquire reporter went to his house and, you know, jumped over his fence or whatever. The next day, my boss said to me, called me into her office again and said, you're never going to speak to Jerry. He's not going to call. If he does call, the receptionist is going to put him through directly to me. You know, if I'm not there, she'll take a message. If by some crazy chance somebody messes up and he gets put through to you, don't talk to him. Don't keep him on the phone. Don't tell him you love The Catcher in the Rye. He doesn't want to hear it. He doesn't care about you. He doesn't care that you love The Catcher in the Rye. He doesn't want to hear about your life. He doesn't want to hear about the stories you're writing, and he doesn't want to read them. Don't talk to him. Just say, I'll tell my boss you called, and get off the phone. So meanwhile, she tells me this, but she was like, but it doesn't matter because he's never going to call. An hour later, he called. And so it turned out the reason he was calling, to make a long story short, he had decided that he wanted to publish a new book. His last published story is called Hapworth 161929. It's a letter. I'm sure many of you know the character Seymour Glass from his Glass stories. Seymour Glass's letter home from camp, 65 pages long, largely considered Salinger's worst story. It has its cult followers, but many people consider it unreadable. I'm staying neutral here. And it had been published in The New Yorker. It had taken up a whole issue of The New Yorker. 8 years earlier, a tiny press in Virginia that an English professor operated sort of out of his basement approached Salinger about turning the story into a standalone edition. And so for 8 years, he'd been considering this proposal and decided that he wanted to do it. And so my year at the agency was an anomaly in terms of this particular job, this assistant job, because he suddenly was calling every day. Because many of you may know that Salinger cared tremendously, that's an understatement, about what his books looked like what the physical book was like. So there could be this was in his contracts, no photo of him, no images on the cover, particular fonts, margins, bindings. he got into a fight with his British publisher about hating a binding or something, some arcane thing. So he was calling every day to check in about like, what was the spine going to look like? Was it going to be, was it going to be a horizontal spine or a vertical spine? That kind of thing. And so I spoke to him quite frequently. So about all these things. But I'm making it sound like we were like best buddies, and I don't mean to. What I mean to say is that I was insanely nervous every time he called. And he'd be like, so what do you think about the layout of it? And I'd be like, I don't know. I'll just put you through to my boss. And he'd be like, no, wait, I really want to hear what you think. And he was very nice.
So what was this, why was it not published?
That is a good question. Okay, so if it's okay that there's a spoiler in here, many of you might know this or have heard this story. So part of the reason that he was okay with this new edition, this new book, this new old book, was because he liked the letter from this publisher. This this press was a one-man operation, and the guy wrote to him. He typed his letter on a typewriter. He liked the tone of the letter. He thought this guy seemed nice, and in a way, it seems like part of it was that he was just reaching out and kind of making a new friend, and the two of them became very friendly. Though the publisher, like me, he called all the time too, and he would often call on the days that my boss worked at home, and so we would have these long conversations in which I was kind of his therapist, and he'd be like, so I got this letter from Jerry, and this is what he said. What do you think? Did I upset him? Or he'd be like, I corrected these typos in the story, and Jerry got mad. What do you think I should do? There shouldn't be typos, but he's mad. And I would be like, put the typos back in. He wants the typos. Leave the typos. And I wouldn't say it like that. I'd say, I think you should leave the typos in. And I'd be thinking, please leave the typos in, or he's going to call off this deal, you crazy man. So as you can tell by what I'm saying, what eventually happened was that this guy, this publisher, who had been quite nervous, started to feel much more confident and like he was on really firm ground with Salinger. And he actually gave an interview about the book, which is sort of Salinger's cardinal rule is don't talk to the press. But he gave an interview about the book, and a reporter from the Washington Post called the agency to talk to my boss and get a quote from her about the new book. And she came out and sort of sadly explained this to us, and it was clear that she had to tell Jerry, and so she did, and the deal was off. Yeah. So, anyway. Yes, go ahead.
I assume you've read his books since
Yes, so I read them about 8 months into my time at the agency. I took them all home and read them over the course of one extremely rainy Labor Day weekend. And they changed my life. I loved them. Yeah.
So, since you've had some direct dealings with him, got the sense, the tone, the feeling, to what do you ascribe his maniacal reclusiveness? Was it PTSD or some strange character aberration of some kind of neurotic obsession, or what kind of person came through to you? I was curious.
It's funny. Just today, I did a radio interview here with someone who's a really big personality, and he said, Salinger just was a borderline psychotic. He just was. He was a borderline personality, and I was like, really? I don't know about that. And I know that this new documentary posits that he suffered from PTSD, and that does make sense to me. Not based on my own dealings with him, but just based on reading his work and reading about his life and knowing about his experiences during the war. I don't know that you could go through the things that he went through during World War II and not have some form of PTSD. But in terms of his reclusiveness, I'm certainly not an expert, but my take on it is so much more benign than that. I really think that he was done with New York. And New York is a hard place to live. And he had become a kind of celebrity, and his life had changed. And I think he had been moving away from New York. He had moved to Connecticut for a while. He lived in Westport, Connecticut. It's kind of funny to think about that. J.D. Salinger. I don't know if this means anything to you, but being from like J.D. Salinger in Westport, Connecticut, it's so weird. But he did. He lived in Westport, Connecticut. He had great friends there. Actually, he had moved back to New York briefly and been very unhappy. And I think Salinger. Have you read the Glass stories, or just the Catcher? Okay. Yeah, so if you've read the Glass stories, there's this character, Seymour Glass, who's really, I think, one of the great characters in American literature. Though my favorite Glass character is Franny Glass, or maybe Buddy Glass. Anyway, I love the Glass family. So Seymour Glass, famously in Salinger's very famous story, A Perfect Day for Banana Fish, the story is very short, and basically, I'm trying to avoid the horrible part of it. Basically, Seymour Glass is on his honeymoon with his beautiful but possibly kind of dumb wife, and she talks on the phone to her mom about her clothing. He goes to the beach and plays with this little girl, and then he comes back to their hotel room and shoots himself in the head in front of her. And so that was an early sound. I'm like about to start crying talking about it because it's such a wonderful story. So. And so Seymour Glass, like Salinger, had undergone some pretty awful things during the war. None of the stories are straightforwardly about his experiences during the war. They're all about before and after. So there are these other Glass stories, that talk about Seymour and where you read his diaries. And one of the things that he said, basically, he talks about how there are all these people that he's touched in his life, and he can still feel that they've scarred him, they've burned their essence kind of into his hands, and he can still feel them, that they'll be with him forever. And what emerges over these Glass family stories, over the course of them, if you read them many, many times as I do, or even if you just read them all, is that he is this person who's somehow too sensitive for the world. He can't live in the world, right? And so he was a child genius. That's part of it, but he just also somehow can't cope with the sadness of just everyday life, that everything is too much for him. Even things that are beautiful are too much for him because he knows that beauty will end, or it overwhelms him. Now he would be called like bipolar or something, probably, I don't know. And I think that I'm explaining this in such length because I think that Seymour, in a way, is a character that Salinger gave a lot of his own qualities to. Physically, Salinger gave him the huge ears that Salinger himself had and the giant height, and they're the same age, and they both fought in the war. And so I think that that's part of what was going on with Salinger. I don't mean to sound like so overly sympathetic or present something that's so contrary to what everyone else in the world thinks, but I really do feel like there was a way in which he was a sort of like an empath or like a sponge, and he couldn't be in the world without absorbing everything around him. And so in order to keep working and keep writing and also just to be sane, he had to retreat from the world. So, and I understand that. I do, actually. I really do. Yeah.
Having spent that year responding to fan mail, does that inform how you respond to your fan mail now? Do you make a point like, I will always write to my fans, or I'll never write to my fans? Or...
Well, it's funny because, I've been getting a lot of fan mail recently. Just like in the last few weeks especially. And I actually have been getting these letters that are similar to the ones I received for Salinger. Just the other day, I received this long, very long, and people write to me on Facebook is the thing, so that you have this strange interface that's really designed for being like, see you at 6, this tiny little screen, and then you keep scrolling and you're like, oh my God, this is like a 6-page letter, and but I received this wonderful letter in which this woman said, I don't know if you remember this, but you actually, I'm a journalist as well, you interviewed me twice, and I talked, you probably remember from the interview that my father killed himself in this whole thing, and I was reading it and I started crying, of course, and, but then I was also like, I'm on a plane, and I can't quite handle this right now. And so the point is, I don't know. I at first was just kind of trying to respond to everyone right away. And we live in an era in which you're expected to be available. But several close friends have said to me, you actually have to kind of step back a little and not be so available just for your own sanity. But I will say that, it's like 1/1,000,000th of what Salinger experienced, but it really does actually make me understand a bit more what that's like, just getting these letters, because he tried to respond to his fan mail for years. And he entered into correspondences with people, and he was offering them advice about writing and about life and all this stuff. He was amazing. But then he just was like, people, I have to have a life, and I have children and a wife, and, so. Oh, wait, let this lady.
Yeah. So first of all, I wanted to commend you being so brave. I don't look at it as being found out. You were actually, I thought, very human in trying to make your answers, more personal, I guess, to these people. And I love Salinger as a writer, but I going back to his later years, and I've read about his children, how they responded towards him, and they felt totally isolated. He would hide himself
Yes.
in a cabin and not relate to them. And obviously he had, but I also feel, I guess, empathy with him because of what he went through in the war, and I guess the impression that he had on for generations with The Catcher in Rye, and how people would kind of use him as a hero, which he didn't really feel like he was.
It's so true.
So,
yeah.
He was human like everybody else, but it's kind of, I guess, alarming the way that people can make a hero out of somebody that was just a writer, really, and going through his own pain, and they kind of idolized him, and obviously that's what he had to escape from, and kind of destroyed him in a way too, but really as a great artist, which was kind of sad.
You're so right. And I guess the thing that I just want to point out that you're getting at is that I don't think that we, at this moment in history, can understand the level of Salinger's celebrity. Like, he was as famous as a film star. He really, truly was a celebrity. There's no writer today who is as famous as he was in the 50s and 60s. When a new Salinger story was coming out in the New Yorker, people would line up at newsstands before they opened to get the New Yorker, before, not wanting it to sell out, wanting to get it the minute it came off the presses. I think literature held a different place in American culture than it does now, and just the world was so different. And I think that celebrity really was very hard for him. It was what he wanted in a way, but then he got it and he didn't know what to do with it.
We have time for one more question over here, Dr. Posnick.
I was just thinking that there's a certain element of models, people like Philip Roth and some other people. My only question is, has your agent hired somebody to take care of all of your fan mail? And do you need a good form letter?
That's an excellent question. Just yesterday, someone said to me, "You know what you need? You need a personal assistant." Actually, he said, "You need a PA." And I said, "A production assistant?" And because I had been a PA. And he said, "No, a personal assistant to deal with all this stuff." I was like, "Really?" And no, but maybe. Anyway, thank you so much.
All right, folks, quick reminder for our internet audience at home. You still have time to call the number on your screen. Get a copy of my Salinger Year. Joanna will sign it for you, and we'll ship it to wherever you are in the United States free of charge. For those of you here in the house, we have my Salinger Year as well as Joanna's novel, A Fortunate Age, for sale at the counter over there. She'll be signing here at the table to the left of the podium, and this was such a wonderful event. Why don't we give Joanna another hand, please? Thanks very much.
Thank you.